Blades of Fire, a third-person action-adventure game with a fairly unique twist on the Souls-like formula. It absolutely is safe to say that I am not the target demographic for Blades of Fury, but it was a unique take on the Souls-like combat that drew me in. It's because of the Souls-like combat that I keep telling myself, I'm not who this game is made for. That style of play isn't my favourite. I've mostly dabbled in Elden Ring and Ghost of Tsushima, and Souls-likes demand patience, precise timing, and a mastery of dodges and parries. None of that comes naturally to me, so getting into this kind of game has always been a struggle. That said, I approached Blades of Fire in almost exactly the same way I tackled Elden Ring. Slow, tedious progress where I missed the obvious path forward and died repeatedly. At times, moving through Blades of Fire felt agonizingly slow and brutally frustrating. But despite the frustrations, there's a certain retro charm at the core that kept me compelled to keep pushing forward. Of the main pillars of gameplay, the biggest is by far combat, and it's exactly what you might expect for a Souls-like. Dodges will be your bread and butter alongside timing parries to open up moments to strike at your foe. The unique aspect of combat for Blades of Fire, and the thing that enticed me into a game I wouldn't usually play, is that it comprises almost entirely of directional attacks. Square, triangle, circle and cross will attack left, head, right and body respectively, and you will need to flow between the direction you swing your weapon type and the strike type in order to ensure that you inflict the maximum amount of damage. As an inexperienced Souls-like player, I initially found the system to be a really interesting take on the combat, expanding it to be more than just the usual light attack, heavy attack and ranged. Blades of Fire unfortunately doesn't capitalise the combat system in a way that keeps it engaging, and it quickly becomes a repetitive and at times annoying system to manage. Every foe that you face will be weak to a type of attack such as a blunt damage from a warhammer or piercing and slashing damage from a sword. Some weapons will only be able to do one type of damage, and some weapons will be able to switch between different types. When targeting an enemy, different parts of their body will be highlighted in red, orange or green. Green areas will take maximum damage from your equipped weapon and strike type. Orange areas are partially armoured and might only take 40 to 60% of the damage, and red highlighted areas will be heavily armoured with steel plate and might only receive less than 20% of the damage. A lot of the time it will be zero. There are many enemies you will commonly face that are essentially cannon fodder that will be fully highlighted in green, and pretty much any attack will take them down with ease. In addition to this, heavy attacks can be made by holding down the attack button for that direction. These heavy attacks have the ability to mutilate your foe, which for most foes will result in lopping off a body part when you kill them. This starts off being a really cool way to take down unsuspecting enemies, with it being extremely satisfying to run up to someone and decapitate them in a single strike. But like the rest of the combat, there isn't enough variation to keep it interesting. Every weapon will decapitate or chop off an arm for their mutilation, including hammers. After several hours, I got an achievement for having killed 1,500 enemies. At that time, combat had settled into a rhythm where most weak enemies would be struck down in a single heavy strike, with the more engaging combat being against stronger enemies and bosses, who will require you to work around their attack pattern to get a strike in. Despite the rote nature of the combat, I did still find it somewhat challenging, which I actually quite liked. Part of this comes down to my perpetual inability to master parrying in most games, leading me to craft weapons with little care for parry times and focus more on higher damage and stamina to maintain my ability to dodge and open myself up to more damage that I would otherwise be taking if I was able to parry. We'll discuss crafting a little later. There were a few other main aspects that contributed to the game's challenge level outside of my own mediocre ability. One is the difficulty selections. These will change parry timings for enemy attacks and increase damage done and received. Now, I am a big advocate for games offering extensive difficulty selections to allow players to tailor their difficulty to their playstyle and ability. So I was actually rather disappointed that this wasn't available in Blaze of Fire, particularly as the ability to change things like parry timings is already available through the weapon system. I think being able to finely tune the difficulty would have gone a long way to helping overcome some of those frustrating moments that often came down to a mix of skill and the design of combat. I kept the game on Steel though, which is the hardest and recommended difficulty, for a long time, and I found this to be fairly challenging, but not too challenging that it put me off just getting stuck in. However, this quickly changed when I entered the game's second hub area of the Crimson Fort. Here I encountered what felt to be a rather harsh jump in difficulty for the game. The Crimson Fort is an area that features a roaming mini-boss, an increase in enemy density, and a maze-like structure of narrow corridors, but I spent many more hours stuck here than I suspect I was intended to and would care to admit. The narrow spaces made dodging far more difficult, fighting not only the groups of enemies that I would encounter, but also their camera to ensure I could see where I was dodging to not get stuck against a wall and stun locked. In these tight spaces and in situations involving anything more than 3 enemies, the combat system starts to severely falter. It becomes cumbersome to switch between weapons and strike types mid-combat, while also attempting to dodge and block enemy attacks from multiple angles, and when crowds of enemies grow large, most attacks will end up ineffectual anyway, as attempts to take out a specific target will result in your target lock bouncing between near enemies, and attacks either bouncing off enemies that get in the way, or the environment itself. I found myself up against a major progress roadblock here for a long time. Dying means having to fight your way back to where you were in order to retrieve your weapon, which, depending on the distance between unlocking a new anvil, could be a big task. Hitting a point where I was dying and having to do this retrieval run again and again slowed my progress immensely at a relatively early point into the game, and pushed me to just drop the difficulty down so I could have an easier time navigating and just get through the area I was in. Once I got out of the Crimson Fort, this difficulty spike just disappeared and the game dropped down in difficulty immensely. I suspect because we went back into being in relatively open areas of the world. Add in unclear objectives for how to move the story forward in the Crimson Fort, for which I literally spent hours running circles not only around the Crimson Fort, but other areas of the map too, before the way forward became apparent. And it was a moment where all of the worst aspects of the game came together in a way that was brutally frustrating, an experience that had me genuinely questioning whether or not I would even continue this review. Ultimately, combat in Blaze of Fire is simple and repetitive. It promises a lot of depth, being tied so heavily to its weapon crafting system, but it fails to deliver. Despite this though, the whole appears to be greater than the sum of its parts, and I found that combat was quite a compelling part of the game overall, and actually a large part of my enjoyment of the game. The next big pillar of Blaze of Fire is crafting. While combat is probably the biggest aspect of gameplay, crafting is definitely the most important. Every weapon you wield as Aaron is one that has been handcrafted by you. The level of customization varies for each weapon, and more customization options can be unlocked through shrines that commonly are found in the world. You start off with a few basic designs and can earn schematics for unlocking new weapon types by killing certain amounts of the enemies that wield them. Each weapon will naturally lean towards a specific style of gameplay, whether that's quick attacks with twin daggers or slow and heavy blows from a warhammer. When selecting a weapon to forge, you have a lot of options to tailor the weapon to how you prefer to play, including the blade length, guard and pommel size, curvature, the type of wood or steel to be used to craft the weapon. Each of the different options will contribute to the weapon's stats, allowing you to find balance between attack stats such as damage and armor penetration, defensive stats such as block strength and parry timings, or durability stats. Crafting is also tied to exploration in a way that makes both a little bit more compelling. Exploring the world will naturally provide materials to use in crafting as you defeat enemies and unlock new ingredients with new enemies encountered, though there is only actually a relatively small number of enemy types, and aforementioned shrines will unlock new options for different weapon types, while chests might include skill scrolls that will allow you to build Aran to be able to craft higher quality weapons of types of your choosing. Weapon quality being extremely important, as this directly ties to how many times you'll be able to repair that weapon before it permanently breaks. Whenever you craft a weapon, you must complete the craft by completing a forge minigame. In this minigame, you must strike the audio equalizer inspired metal segments of the blade in order to match the weapon's shape. The closer you match it, the more stars you get, with each star representing one repair of the weapon. A 5-star quality weapon can repair 5 times, and in my playthrough I got a weapon quality up to 7 stars. The minigame takes a little getting used to. In order to get the metal segments in the right places, you have the option of changing the strength, size and tilt of each strike you make, allowing you to really precisely change the shape of the segments. I really enjoyed the minigame actually. It really helped to sell the immersion of having these godly forge abilities, and created a stronger bond with the weapon making, while also making the durability aspect of the weapons feel not so egregious. You will go through a lot of weapons as you play, each that breaks or is dropped out in the world when you die, but each new weapon crafted feels like a good jump in quality and strength, and as you earn more stars and use better ingredients. The ever improving quality of the weapons you craft and the ability to recycle broken weapons to get back either random materials or a large number of a specific material when traded to a particular NPC makes the whole system feel worth it. Exploration outside of finding shrines and chests contribute to your crafting ability I found to be at best somewhat boring and at worst poorly designed and incredibly frustrating. For the most part, the game doesn't explicitly tell you what your current objective is, other than a nebulous work your way to the Queen and kill her. So the majority of your time with the story will be spent navigating the world to find the next trigger for the story. Sometimes this is more guided than other times, but for the most part you're free to figure it out in your own way. Though if you are struggling, there is an option to show where the next objective is that can be accessed through the pause menu. Most of the map itself is a series of narrow tunnels with varying open spaces you might encounter enemies in. The game promises a lot of freedom when it presents the world to you and says, off you go kill the Queen. But because of the way the world is laid out, it actually is quite linear, and often in a particularly frustrating way when the cues for where to go next maybe weren't as apparent as they needed to be. Each area has a number of different routes that can be used to navigate around. As you progress through, shortcuts can be unlocked to make travel between different points a little quicker and easier. On top of this, you also have anvils scattered across the world that you can fast travel between, travel to forge weapons to craft, repair and recycle weapons, or rest to replenish health files and respawn enemies. I found the linear nature of areas to really hinder the experience of exploring the world. Once the linearity becomes apparent, exploration started to feel far less rewarding and instead became an exercise in just following all the routes to uncover everything rather than naturally finding things out in the world. This is made more apparent by the lack of large open spaces and visible points of interest to guide your exploration, so it often feels like more of a chore or required to reach the next area rather than an enjoyable side aspect of the game. I really enjoyed the characters though and the world itself. In Blaze of Fire, you play as Aran, a blacksmith granted great power and tasked with a quest to kill the Queen, who used to be his friend. Aran is joined on this quest with a young companion named Adso, who, though lacking the martial skill and strength of Aran, is well versed in history and magic, providing Aran with the vital assistance he will need along the way. The dynamic between Aran and his new companion of Adso is a nice one, clearly modelled on the appeal of Kratos and Atreus, but it often feels quite forced. Within the story, these characters have only just met, but almost immediately have an incredibly familiar father and son-esque relationship that just doesn't quite land. It's particularly noticeable during moments of banter between the two. Every time I climbed a ladder, Adso made a comment about me falling off or being too heavy for it, and it just felt so desperate. Given a little more time to foster their relationship, it would have worked far better, but given that they meet for the first time in the game's opening and then almost immediately have this open and trusting bond, it just seemed odd. And perhaps in part that's down to the way the game's story is presented. The story is fairly sparse, with much of the information being discovered in the world. The lack of quests or objectives forced you to explore to discover the way to move forward, but often left me feeling a little unsure as to what was actually going on. The overarching narrative of the game is focused around traversing the world in order to reach and kill the Queen, who has cast some kind of spell to turn all of the steel in the world to stone, except that which is used by her soldiers. Each area you traverse has a story that feels very self-contained, with the connective elements not as visible as they could be. The zones themselves are fairly varied in design, but the intended path to complete the zone's story is often fairly uneven. In some areas I found myself circling again and again to uncover the step required to move on, while the next zone would be an almost straight path through the zone with little thought required to figure out what needed to be done next. The story is set up so that Adso is able to provide clues about what is required next and provide information about your current area and the characters you've met. While Adso's lore tidbits and information about lore were interesting additions that made the world feel fleshed out, the information provided to guide you towards the next objective was often vague and generic to the overall goal of the zones, rather than tailored to the specific task. There were so many moments as I played where I wanted to utilise Adso to learn a bit more about where I was, what I was doing and who I was interacting with, but the information he was giving me was always the same no matter how far through a zone I'd seemingly progressed. The world does suffer for something that many of these kind of games suffer from, in that the world feels completely abandoned as a result of the only people you interact with being your enemies and the occasional ally. The allies are usually one person per zone, so the zones themselves, while pleasingly designed, are somewhat generic in their aesthetic and almost entirely empty. If I'm honest, I feel as though I'm in several minds about Blades of Fire. I can only approach this through my own experiences as a novice to Souls-like experience, and as a novice, there are many elements that I may not have had as much patience with or drawn as much enjoyment from as a seasoned player of these kind of games, and eventually my tolerance for these elements wore a bit thin. Obviously, kudos have to go out to Blades of Fire for having an interesting enough premise to draw in a potential convert, and I did, for the most part, enjoy my time with Blades of Fire, so shout out to the devs for that. On offer in Blades of Fire is an interesting story with engaging characters, simple, fun combat, and a gorgeous environment. There's a charm to the writing and aesthetic that's reminiscent of the PlayStation 3 and 360 era of games that really reminded me of games such as Fable or Brutal Legend, and a stunningly haunting soundtrack to accompany it all. Where it perhaps is let down the most is its uneven pacing, characterization that at times feels unnatural and unearned, and the combat system being a bit too simplistic to the point where it's often flawed enough to tip the balance of challenge to one of frustration. The story, while interesting, is let down by the way it's told, making it difficult to forge the early connection and intrigue that a game needs to keep the player engaged. And for me, though I was enjoying the game, by the 25th or so hour of my playthrough, the repetitive combat, frequent lack of direction was starting to take their toll, and I think I about hit my limit. There's a lot of good here and a lot that I enjoyed as I played through the game, but ultimately the frustrating elements are greater than the good elements. Sure, I could have continued to slog my way through, but the frustrating elements chip away at your tolerance, and when the game hits a point that combat starts to feel more like a chore than a fun and challenging experience, it was time to quit while I was ahead.